Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I never imagined I would be the kind of daughter my own parents would deliberately leave out. Not forgotten, not overlooked, but intentionally uninvited. It still sounds unreal when I say it out loud. My parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. 40 years. That's a lifetime. I grew up believing their marriage was something sacred, something solid and unbreakable. My father used to tell people, if you want to know what commitment looks like, look at my wife. And my mother would laugh, brushing him off like it was nothing. I believed in them the way children believe in the sky. I'm their only daughter. My older brother, Daniel, moved to another state years ago. It was always me who stayed close. I was the one who drove Mom to her appointments when Dad was too busy. I was the one who helped them refinance the house when money got tight. I was the one who showed up. So when I heard through my cousin, that there was a big anniversary party planned at the Lakeside Banquet Hall, I thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. I laughed at first. "That's sweet," I told her. "Mom must be planning it as a surprise for Dad." There was a pause on the other end of the phone, the kind of pause that doesn't feel right. "Claire," she said gently, you do know about it, right?" I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at the sink full of dishes, feeling something cold spread across my chest. Know about what? And that was how I found out. There were invitations, printed ones, gold lettering, RSVP cards, the whole thing. 70 guests, extended family, church friends, Dad's business associates. Even Daniel was flying in from Chicago. But me? My name wasn't on the list. I didn't call them right away. I told myself there had to be a mistake. Maybe Mom assumed I already knew. Maybe she thought it didn't need to be formal. I tried to reason it out, because the alternative, the idea that they had consciously chosen not to invite me, was too painful to accept. 3 days later, I went over to their house. Mom was in the garden trimming her roses. She looked up when she saw me, smiling like nothing was wrong, like everything was normal. "Claire, honey, you should have called." I walked toward her slowly. "I wanted to talk to you about something." She straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. There was something in her eyes, not guilt exactly, more like preparation. "I heard about the anniversary party," I said carefully. She didn't react the way I expected. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask how I found out. Instead, she sighed. "Your mother sighing at you like you're the problem. That's a different kind of hurt." "Oh," she said, "I was going to talk to you." "When?" My voice shook despite my effort to stay calm. "After it happened?" She took off her gloves, folding them neatly. "Claire, we just thought it might be better this way." "Better?" I whispered. "For everyone." That was when my father came out onto the porch. He must have heard our voices. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "We didn't invite you," he said plainly. "We need this day to be peaceful." Peaceful? I stared at him, waiting for him to explain what that meant, waiting for some clarification that would make this less cruel. "From what?" I asked. My mother looked away. My father didn't. "From tension," he said. "From conflict. From drama." Drama? I felt like I'd been slapped. "What drama?" I demanded. Neither of them answered directly. They didn't have to. I knew what they were referring to. 6 months earlier, I had confronted my brother about money, a loan my parents had quietly given him, nearly $30,000, to help with a business opportunity that had already failed twice before. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply asked why they hadn't told me, especially when I was the one who was covering their mortgage payments during that same year. Daniel exploded. He called me controlling, accused me of trying to manage everyone's lives. My parents sided with him, not openly, but subtly enough. And now, apparently, I was the source of tension. "I was trying to protect you," I said quietly. "All of you." My father's jaw tightened. "You were interfering." Interfering. I stood there in the garden I had helped replant after Mom's surgery last spring, the same garden where I had spent hours kneeling in the dirt beside her. And I realized something that hurt more than the words themselves. They had already decided. This wasn't a conversation, it was an announcement. "We just want one day," my mother added softly, without feeling judged. Judged. I nodded slowly, even though my chest felt like it was collapsing inward. "So you'd rather I not be there?" Silence. That was answer enough. I left without raising my voice. I didn't cry in front of them. I drove home in a blur and sat in my car in the driveway for nearly an hour. I kept replaying the word peaceful in my mind, as if my presence alone disrupted something sacred. But here's what they didn't know. For the past 8 months, I had been working on something, quietly, carefully, a surprise for their anniversary. Not a small one, not flowers or a photo album. I had refinanced my own house, taken on extra shifts, sold a few pieces of jewelry that belonged to my grandmother. I had purchased the property next door to theirs, the small, empty lot that had been up for sale for years, the one my father always said he wished he could buy but never could afford. I had plans drawn up, a sunroom extension, a proper garden greenhouse for Mom, a covered patio for Dad's summer barbecues. I'd even hired an architect. My gift to them was going to be the deed. They didn't know the closing had finalized the week before they told me I wasn't invited. The envelope was sitting in my car that day when I drove to their house. I had planned to give it to them privately before the party to let them decide how to announce it. Instead, I drove home with it still sealed. I told myself I wouldn't go to the anniversary. I told myself I would mail the gift after. Maybe I would include a polite card, something distant. But as the day approached, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. If they wanted peace, I would give them peace, but I would also give them truth. On the night of the anniversary, I dressed in a simple navy blue dress, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. I placed the large ivory envelope carefully in a gift box and tied a silver ribbon around it. And then I drove to the lakeside banquet hall. I wasn't on the guest list, I knew that, but I wasn't going there to eat cake or make a scene. I was going there to deliver my gift and walk away. What I didn't expect was what would happen when they finally opened it. The lakeside banquet hall was glowing when I pulled into the parking lot. Warm yellow lights wrapped around the columns outside, and through the tall windows, I could see silhouettes moving, glasses raised, people laughing. It looked beautiful, perfect, peaceful. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone. I reminded myself of that over and over. I was there to give a gift I had prepared with love. What they chose to do with it after that was out of my hands. I stepped out into the cool evening air and walked toward the entrance, the gift box steady in my arms. The young man at the door smiled politely. "Invitation, please?" "I'm not staying," I said gently. "I just need to drop something off for Richard and Helen Whitmore." He hesitated. The name must have clicked. "Oh, the anniversary couple." "Yes." He looked uncertain, but finally nodded. "You can leave it at the gift table." The ballroom doors were open, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it, the shift in atmosphere. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they dimmed. A few heads turned, then a few more. My Aunt Marlene's eyebrows lifted so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. My cousin, the same one who had called me, gave me a small, sympathetic look. At the center of the room, beneath a canopy of white roses and soft lights, my parents stood together, greeting guests. My mother wore a cream-colored gown. My father had on a tailored gray suit. They looked radiant, like a couple from a magazine spread. For a brief second, I saw them the way I used to, as larger than life, untouchable. Then my father noticed me. His smile didn't disappear, but it tightened, just slightly. My mother followed his gaze. Her hand froze mid-gesture. I walked forward slowly, my heels soft against the polished floor. I kept my expression calm, neutral. I wasn't there to cause a spectacle. "Claire," my mother said quietly as I reached them. Her voice held surprise, but not warmth. "I'm not staying," I said before either of them could speak. "I just wanted to give you this." I extended the box toward them. My father glanced at it like it might explode. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured under his breath, careful not to draw attention. "I know," I replied softly, "but this is important." My mother accepted the box. Her fingers brushed mine, and for a split second, I felt the old familiarity there, the connection that had defined my entire life. Then it slipped away. "We'll open it later," she said. "I'd prefer if you opened it now." Her eyes searched my face. "Claire, it won't take long." A small circle had begun to form around us, people pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. Daniel was standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching like he was anticipating a fight. "This isn't the time," my father said firmly. "I think it is," I answered. My voice didn't shake. That surprised even me. A tension spread through the air, subtle but undeniable. My mother looked down at the box, then back at me. I saw something flicker in her expression. Curiosity, concern, maybe both. She handed it to my father. He untied the ribbon stiffly, as if performing a duty rather than receiving a gift. The lid lifted. Inside was the ivory envelope. He frowned. "Paper?" "Open it," I said. The room had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the music from the string quartet seemed to fade into the background. My father slid a finger beneath the flap and pulled out the contents. Several official documents clipped together. His eye scanned the first page. At first, there was confusion. Then his expression changed. The color drained from his face. My mother leaned in. "Richard." He didn't respond. He kept reading, slower this time. "What is it?" she whispered. He swallowed hard and handed her the top sheet. She read silently, her lips parted. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "It's the deed," I said calmly, "to the lot next door." No one moved. My father looked at me as if I had spoken another language. "What?" "I bought it. It closed last week." My mother's hand trembled as she flipped through the pages. Architectural renderings slid partially free. Images of a glass sunroom extension, a greenhouse with climbing ivy, a covered patio with built-in seating. "You always said you wished you could expand," I continued quietly. "You said it every summer when the neighbors hosted barbecues. You said it when Mom needed more light after her surgery." My father's voice came out hoarse. "Claire, this is over $100,000. "I know." The silence in the ballroom was complete now. Conversations had stopped entirely. Even Daniel looked stunned. "Why?" my mother breathed. The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely bewildered. "Because you're my parents," I answered simply. "Because 40 years is worth celebrating. Because I wanted to give you something that would last." What you chose to do with it after that?
Yes, I saw it then, the crack. Not pride, not stubbornness, shame. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She looked around at the guests, at the decorations I had once imagined helping choose. "You did this for us?" she whispered. I nodded. "For months," I added gently, "while I was interfering." The word hung in the air like a mirror held up to them. Daniel stepped forward finally. "Claire, you didn't have to do this." "No," I agreed, "I didn't." My father lowered himself slowly into the nearest chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. He stared at the documents in his lap. "You refinanced your house," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." My mother covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh, Claire." There were tears now, real ones, not the polite kind. "I didn't come to embarrass you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I came because whether I was invited or not, I'm still your daughter, and I wanted you to know that." A long pause followed, the kind that feels heavy but necessary. My father stood up abruptly. For a second, I thought he might argue, defend himself, double down. Instead, he walked toward me. He stopped just a few inches away. "I thought you were trying to control us," he said, quiet enough for only those closest to hear. "I thought you looked down on us for helping your brother." "I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid you'd lose everything. Afraid you'd be taken advantage of." He closed his eyes briefly. "And instead of listening, we pushed you away." My mother stepped beside him. She reached for my hand. "We told people you were busy," she confessed softly. "We said you couldn't make it." I let out a slow breath. "I wasn't busy." "I know," she whispered. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. For the first time all evening, he looked small. My father turned to face the guests. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the room. "I owe my daughter an apology." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "We told her not to come tonight. We said we needed peace." He looked back at me. "But the truth is, we needed humility." The words settled over everything. He extended his hand, not as a father asserting authority, but as a man asking forgiveness. "Will you stay?" he asked quietly. I looked around the room, at the faces watching, at the decorations I had once imagined helping choose. I hadn't planned to stay. But standing there, seeing their defenses fall, not from anger, not from confrontation, but from love, I felt something soften inside me. "I'll stay," I said, and for the first time that evening, the room exhaled.
When I said I would stay, I hadn't realized how much courage that decision would actually require. It's one thing to deliver a gift and walk away with dignity. It's another thing entirely to remain in a room full of people who just witnessed your rejection and your redemption in the same breath. My mother squeezed my hand as if she were afraid I might disappear if she let go. My father cleared his throat and motioned for the band to resume playing, but no one immediately returned to their conversations. The air still held that fragile stillness, like the moment after a storm passes when you're not sure if the sky is truly clear. Daniel approached me slowly. My older brother had always carried himself with confidence, sometimes bordering on arrogance. Tonight, that edge was gone. "You really bought the lot?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in something closer to shame. "You didn't tell anyone." It wasn't about anyone else knowing. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, then stopped. For once, he seemed to understand that this wasn't a debate to win. "I didn't mean for things to get this far," he said finally. "I know," I replied. And I did. That was the hard part. Daniel had always been impulsive, always chasing the next opportunity. My parents had always believed he would land on his feet if they just supported him long enough. I had simply been the one asking what would happen if he didn't. But tonight wasn't about reopening that argument. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin and turned to the guests. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but sincere, "let's celebrate. Our daughter is here." Our daughter. The words wrapped around me in a way I hadn't expected. They shouldn't have felt like a gift. They should have been a given. And yet, after the past few weeks, they felt earned. As the music resumed, people began to move again. Conversations picked up, though now there was a new tone to them, quieter, more reflective. Several relatives approached me one by one. Aunt Marlene hugged me tightly. "I had no idea," she whispered. "If I'd known." "It's all right," I said, and surprisingly I meant it. My cousin squeezed my arm. "You handled that beautifully." I didn't feel beautiful. I felt drained, but I smiled anyway. My father stepped up to the microphone a few minutes later, tapping it lightly. The feedback squealed for a second before settling. "I had prepared a speech," he began, glancing at the folded paper in his hand. "Something about 40 years of marriage, about patience and devotion." He paused. "But I think tonight calls for something more honest." The room quieted again. I have always prided myself on being a strong man, on providing for my family, on making decisions I believed were best. He looked directly at me. But strength without listening becomes pride. My throat tightened. I accused my daughter of interfering when she was trying to protect us. I confused concern for control. And instead of having a difficult conversation, I chose comfort. I chose the easier path. He took a slow breath. I chose to exclude her. A murmur of discomfort moved through the crowd. That was wrong. There it was, plain, undeniable. My mother joined him at the microphone. "I told myself I wanted peace," she admitted, "but what I really wanted was to avoid conflict. I didn't want to feel caught between my children, so I pretended there wasn't a problem." She turned to me fully. "Claire, I am sorry." The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simple and real, and somehow that made it heavier. "I forgive you," I said softly, and I did. Not because what they did didn't hurt. It did, deeply, but because holding on to that hurt would have meant undoing the very love that led me to buy that property in the first place. After the speeches, dinner was served. I found myself seated between my parents, as if reclaiming a position that had been vacant only hours earlier. My mother kept touching my arm absent-mindedly, as though reassuring herself that I was truly there. Halfway through the meal, my father leaned toward me. "We need to talk about that refinance," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have taken that risk alone." "It wasn't a risk, it was an investment." "In us." "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't have to prove your love with money." I met his eyes. I wasn't proving anything. I was expressing it. That seemed to settle something inside him. Across the table, Daniel cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, too," he said, not meeting my gaze at first. "I've leaned on Mom and Dad more than I should have, and when you questioned it, I got defensive." "You were scared," I said gently. "Yeah, I was." For years, I had been cast as the critical one, the practical one, the one who asked uncomfortable questions. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like they were beginning to see that practicality didn't cancel out love. It was another form of it. Later in the evening, as cake was being served, my mother pulled me aside to a quieter corner of the ballroom. "When did you start planning it?" "I started last winter, after your surgery, when you mentioned how hard it was not having enough light in the house." Her eyes welled again. "I didn't even remember saying that." "I did." She reached up and cupped my cheek the way she used to when I was a child. "We underestimated you," she said. "You thought you were trying to take control, but you were just carrying responsibility we didn't want to face." I swallowed. "I never wanted to replace you or make you feel incapable. I know that now." The evening slowly transformed from tense to warm. Laughter returned, but it sounded different, less forced, more genuine.
When the band played their song, the one my parents had danced to at their wedding, I watched them take the floor. But this time, my father looked at me first. "Dance with us," he called. I hesitated only a second before joining them. The three of us stood there awkwardly at first, then naturally swaying together. It wasn't choreographed, it wasn't graceful. It was real. And in that moment, I realized something important. Being excluded hurt deeply, but it had also revealed something fragile in our family that needed to be addressed. Silence had allowed assumptions to grow. Avoidance had disguised itself as peace. But love, when it's genuine, has a way of forcing truth into the light. By the time the night ended, guests were hugging us goodbye, whispering about what a beautiful celebration it had turned into. And it had. Not because of the decorations or the music, because honesty had replaced pride. As I walked out with my parents into the cool night air, my father slipped his arm around my shoulders. "You know, I always wanted that lot, but I never thought I deserved it." I looked up at him. "You do." He smiled softly. "And so do you." For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the weight in my chest felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Because sometimes the most powerful gift isn't the one wrapped in ribbon. It's the one that forces everyone to finally see each other clearly. The night ended with more hugs than I could count. People who had once avoided eye contact with me were suddenly clasping my hands, telling me how proud they were, how beautiful it all had been. I smiled politely, but I understood something they didn't. The real work hadn't happened in that ballroom. It had only begun. When I got home that night, I didn't cry the way I expected to. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my navy dress, and stared at the quiet walls of my room. The house felt different, lighter, but also uncertain. Apologies are powerful, yes, but they don't erase patterns overnight. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. It was my father. He wasn't a morning caller. That alone told me something had shifted. "Are you awake?" he asked. "Yes." There was a pause. I could hear the sound of a coffee mug being set down on a table. "I didn't sleep much," he admitted. "Neither did I." Another pause. Not awkward, just thoughtful. "I kept replaying yesterday," he said. "The look on your face when we told you to come back." I closed my eyes. I didn't want to relive that part, but I appreciated that he was. "I was hurt," I said simply. "I know." His voice softened. "I've spent years telling people that family is everything, and then I treated you like you were optional." The honesty in his tone reached me in a way the public apology couldn't. This wasn't for an audience. This was just us. "You're not optional," he continued. "You never were." I swallowed past the tightness in my throat. "Thank you. I want to make this right, not just with words." That was the first time I believed this wasn't just guilt talking. It was intention. Later that afternoon, my parents came over, not with fanfare, not with defensiveness. They sat at my kitchen table like we had done so many times before, but there was something more vulnerable about them now. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. "We've been thinking," she said carefully, "about the money, about Daniel." I stiffened slightly, but I didn't pull away. "We enabled him," my father said bluntly, "and when you questioned it instead of listening, we felt exposed." "I wasn't trying to embarrass you," I said. "We know that now," my mother replied. "You were trying to protect us, but we didn't want to feel like we needed protection." That hit something deep. Pride can disguise itself so convincingly as independence. My father cleared his throat. "We've decided no more loans to Daniel." I blinked. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said firmly. "If he wants help, it will be guidance, not money." It wasn't triumph, I felt. It was relief. "I don't want you to feel like I'm controlling your choices," I said carefully. "I just don't want you to suffer because you're trying to save someone else." "We understand that now," my mother said softly. We talked for hours that afternoon, really talked, not the surface level exchanges we had fallen into over the past year, but honest, uncomfortable conversations about expectations, about fear, about aging and vulnerability. At one point, my father admitted something that surprised me. He said slowly, "When Daniel struggles, I see myself at his age. I made risky decisions too. The only difference is my father wasn't in a position to bail me out." "And you don't want him to feel abandoned," I said. "Yes, but there's a difference between support and rescue," I replied gently. He nodded. "I'm starting to see that." It wasn't a perfect resolution. Families are never that simple, but it was a beginning. A week later, we met with the architect together. The three of us sat around a table covered in blueprints for the expansion next door. My mother's eyes lit up as she traced the outline of the greenhouse. "All this light," she whispered. "I can grow orchids again." My father studied the patio design like it was a new business venture. "We could host Thanksgiving out here," he said. "You could," I agreed. There was something healing about planning something forward instead of arguing about the past. But the true test came when Daniel called. He asked to meet for coffee, just the two of us. I almost declined. Old wounds don't vanish easily, but I agreed. He looked tired when he walked into the cafe, not defeated, just aware. He said after we sat down, "I didn't realize how much they were leaning on you, not just financially, emotionally." "They're our parents," I said. "It's not about keeping score." He nodded. "I know, but I let you carry the heavy stuff while I chased things that didn't work." There it was. Accountability. "I don't resent you," I said honestly. "I just needed you to see it." He exhaled slowly. "I do now." We didn't magically become perfect siblings that afternoon, but something shifted. The defensiveness was gone. In its place was a kind of cautious respect. Construction on the lot began 2 months later. Watching the foundation being poured felt symbolic in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just concrete being laid, it was trust being rebuilt. One evening, as the sun was setting, my mother and I stood side by side watching the frame of the greenhouse take shape. "I keep thinking about what you said," she murmured. "About what?" "About love not needing to be proven with money." I smiled faintly. "Your words, not mine." She squeezed my arm. "You shouldn't have felt like you had to give something so grand to be seen." "I didn't do it to be seen," I said gently. "I did it because I love you." She nodded slowly. "And we almost let pride cost us that." There was a long silence as we watched workers secure the beams. "Why did you really come that night?" she asked suddenly. "You could have mailed it." I thought about it carefully before answering. "Because if I mailed it, you would have opened it privately. You might have thanked me politely, and nothing else would have changed." She looked at me, understanding dawning. But opening it there meant the truth couldn't hide. She inhaled sharply, not offended, just recognizing the courage it had taken. "I didn't come to embarrass you," I added. "I came because I didn't want silence to win." Tears gathered in her eyes again, but this time they weren't from shock or shame. They were from clarity. "You saved us from ourselves," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, I just refused to let distance grow where love was supposed to be." The greenhouse was completed by early spring. The first time sunlight poured through the glass panels and illuminated the rows of seedlings, my mother stood in the center and cried openly. My father wrapped an arm around her, then reached for me with the other. "This," he said quietly, "is what family should feel like. Not perfect, not without conflict, but honest." And I realized something that day. Being uninvited felt like rejection, like erasure, but it forced a confrontation that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. It forced all of us to confront pride, fear, and the roles we had quietly assigned each other. I was the responsible one. Daniel was the dreamer. My parents were the protectors. But life changes, roles blur, and if you don't talk about it, resentment fills the gaps. Standing in that greenhouse, surrounded by warmth and light, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not even vindication, just peace. The real kind, the kind that doesn't come from avoiding tension, but from walking straight through it with love intact. If you had told me a year earlier that I would one day stand inside a greenhouse I built for my parents after being deliberately excluded from their anniversary, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. But life has a strange way of forcing you into moments you never planned for, then asking you to decide who you want to be inside them. The greenhouse became more than a structure. It became neutral ground. Every Sunday afternoon, my mother and I worked there together. She showed me how to prune orchids properly, how to tell when the soil needed aerating just by the way it felt between her fingers. I had spent so many years being the practical one, the organizer, the one handling paperwork and payments, that I had forgotten she had skills I admired. "You always rush," she told me one afternoon, gently adjusting my grip on a stem. "Plants don't respond to urgency." I smiled. "Neither do people, apparently." She glanced at me knowingly. We learned that the hard way. The tension that had once hung between us felt different now. It hadn't vanished completely. Real relationships rarely reset to zero. But it no longer felt sharp. It felt understood. My father took ownership of the patio construction like it was a personal mission. He met with contractors, discussed materials, debated over grill placements as if the future of civilization depended on it. I watched him reclaim a sense of control. Not defensive control, but healthy engagement. One evening, as we sat on temporary folding chairs overlooking the nearly finished space, he surprised me. "You know what scared me the most?" he asked. "What?" "That you might stop trying." I turned toward him. "Trying?" "Yes, trying with us after we told you not to come." I let that settle for a moment. "I thought about it," I admitted quietly. "Not coming, not pushing, not insisting. And I realized silence would be easier, but it would also be permanent." He nodded slowly. I didn't want permanent. Neither did I. Across town, Daniel was navigating his own reckoning. Without the steady stream of financial rescue, he had been forced to reassess his latest failed venture. At first, he was angry at the world, at circumstances, at timing, but eventually he started asking different questions. One afternoon, he showed up at the greenhouse unannounced. I stiffened instinctively when I saw him walking up the path, old habits. But his posture wasn't defensive, it was tentative. "Mom said you'd be here," he said. "We usually are." He stepped inside, looking around at the rows of blooming plants. "It's impressive," I replied. "Mom deserves it." He nodded. Then, after a long pause, he said something I didn't expect. "I've been applying for stable positions." I blinked. "Like jobs?" He gave a small, sheepish smile. "Yes, jobs." It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the ambitious entrepreneurial path he had always chased, but it was grounded. "I thought you hated the idea of a 9-to-5, I said carefully. "I hate failing more," he answered honestly, "and I'm tired of dragging everyone else into it." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no defensiveness, just clarity. "I don't want to be the reason Mom and Dad fight," he added. "You weren't the reason," she said gently. "Avoidance was." He looked at me thoughtfully. "You really believe that, don't you?" "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "You've always been braver than me." I almost laughed at that. For years, I had been labeled the cautious one, the overthinker, the worrier. "Bravery doesn't always look loud," I said. He nodded. "I'm starting to see that." That conversation marked another quiet shift in our family dynamic. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady. The first major gathering in the new patio space was my father's birthday. It wasn't as large as the anniversary party, just close family and a few friends. But this time, there was no question about my place there. My name wasn't just on the guest list, I helped write it. As guests filtered into the backyard admiring the finished patio and the glow of lights strung overhead, I stood beside my parents welcoming them. "This is all Claire," my father told anyone who would listen. I cringed slightly at the attention. It was a group effort. "It was your vision," he corrected gently. The difference in his tone wasn't about pride in a possession, it was pride in me. One point during the evening, I stepped away from the noise and walked into the greenhouse alone. The air was warm, carrying the scent of soil and blossoms. Soft light filtered through the glass panels. I stood there and let myself feel everything I hadn't fully processed yet. The humiliation of being uninvited, the quiet determination of showing up anyway, the risk of revealing the gift publicly, the vulnerability of staying. I hadn't realized how much courage that entire sequence had required until I stood still enough to acknowledge it. Forgiveness isn't passive. It isn't weakness. It's an active decision to keep loving when pride would rather withdraw. My mother joined me quietly. "I had a dream the other night," she said softly. "What about?" "That you didn't come to the anniversary, that you mailed the gift, and we opened it alone." She swallowed. "In the dream, we thanked you, and then we never talked about it again." A chill moved through me. "That would have been easier," I said. "Yes," she agreed, "and emptier." She reached for my hand. "I'm grateful you didn't choose easy." I squeezed her fingers gently. "So am I." Outside, laughter rose from the patio. My father was telling one of his exaggerated stories, and Daniel was actually listening instead of scrolling through his phone. For the first time in a long while, our family felt balanced, not because we had eliminated conflict, but because we had learned to face it. As the evening wound down, my father tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. "I've already given one apology speech this year, so I'll keep this short." He looked at me directly. "This space behind me," he continued, gesturing to the patio and greenhouse, "isn't just an expansion of our house, it's an expansion of our understanding." Guests murmured approvingly. We almost let pride divide us, but love showed up anyway. His eyes softened. "Sometimes the person you think is disrupting your peace is the one protecting your future." The words settled over me like warmth. Later that night, as I drove home, I reflected on how close we had come to drifting apart permanently, all because none of us wanted to sit with discomfort. If I had stayed home that night, if I had mailed the envelope, if I had let silence answer for me, we would have lost something we might never have regained. Instead, we gained honesty, and honesty, even when painful, is the strongest foundation a family can build on. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the quiet car for a moment, just as I had done the night they told me I wasn't invited. But this time, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating. Peaceful. The real kind.
Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, testing the ground before it fully rests. That's what the months after the patio celebration felt like. Gentle adjustments, small conversations, subtle corrections in how we treated one another. The most noticeable change wasn't dramatic. It was in the way my parents started including me in their decisions. Not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted to. One afternoon, my father called and asked if I could come over to review some paperwork. In the past, that kind of request would have come with tension, either defensiveness or a silent expectation that I would fix everything without commentary. This time, when I arrived, he had everything neatly organized on the kitchen table. "I don't want you to handle it," he clarified. "I just want your opinion." That distinction mattered. We sat side by side, going through insurance updates and retirement adjustments. At one point he paused, leaning back in his chair. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "for years I thought asking you meant admitting I couldn't manage on my own." I looked at him. "It doesn't. I see that now." He wasn't relinquishing authority. He was sharing responsibility. And that shift changed everything. My mother, too, began opening up about things she had quietly carried. One evening in the greenhouse, as we watered the rose together, she said something that caught me off guard. "I've been afraid of getting older," she admitted softly. I stopped mid-pour. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you're the strong one," she said. "I didn't want to burden you." That old narrative again, the responsible daughter who could handle everything. "You don't burden me by being honest," I said gently. "You burden me when you pretend everything's fine." She smiled faintly. "I'm learning." Daniel's transformation was slower but steady. He took a managerial position at a local company, nothing flashy, nothing groundbreaking, but it came with structure, stability, a paycheck that didn't rely on hope alone. At first, I expected resentment to creep back in. I expected him to blame me quietly for the new boundaries our parents had set. Instead, something unexpected happened. He started visiting more. Not to ask for help, not to pitch ideas, just to be present. One Sunday afternoon, he showed up with groceries and announced he was cooking dinner. My mother looked both thrilled and skeptical. "You?" she teased. "Don't sound so shocked," he replied with a grin. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and onions, and for the first time in years, the four of us moved around each other without tension. There were no whispered side conversations, no undercurrents of judgment. At one point, Daniel pulled me aside while stirring a pot. "I was angry at you," he admitted quietly. "I know. Because when you questioned the loans, it made me feel like a failure. I wasn't calling you one. I see that now." He paused. "You were protecting them, and maybe protecting me too." I hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe he was right. Enabling doesn't just harm the one's giving, it traps the one receiving. "I don't want to be the fragile one anymore," he said. "You're not. You're just human." That night, as we sat around the patio table eating the meal he had prepared, I noticed something subtle but powerful. We were laughing. Not the polite surface-level laughter that fills awkward space, real laughter, the kind that comes when everyone feels safe. A few weeks later, my parents invited extended family over to see the finished greenhouse and patio. Word had spread about the anniversary moment, about the secret gift, but the story had softened over time. It wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about reconciliation. As relatives walked through the glass doors admiring the rows of blooming orchids, my Aunt Marlene pulled me aside. "You changed something in this family," I replied softly. "I didn't change anything," I replied. "You forced honesty," she corrected gently. "That's rare." I didn't feel heroic. I felt relieved, because honesty, as uncomfortable as it had been, had removed the quiet resentment that was poisoning us from the inside. Later that evening, my father raised his glass once more. "I've been thinking about that night," he began, "the night we told Claire she wasn't invited." A hush settled over the group. "I thought I was protecting my peace," he continued, "but what I was really protecting was my pride." He looked at me with steady eyes. "She showed up anyway, not to argue, not to embarrass us, but to love us." There was no dramatic applause this time, just thoughtful nods. "And that's the lesson I've learned at 65, he added. "Peace without honesty isn't peace, it's avoidance." Those words stayed with me long after the guests left, because they weren't just about our family. They were about every relationship where silence masquerades as harmony. A few days later, I found myself sitting alone in the greenhouse at sunset. The light poured in through the glass panels, casting long golden shadows across the floor. I thought back to the moment in the garden when my father had said, "We need this day to be peaceful." At the time, it felt like rejection.
Now I understood something deeper. They were afraid of confrontation, afraid of acknowledging that their financial decisions weren't working, afraid of admitting they needed guidance from their own daughter. Fear makes people do unkind things, but love, real love, gives them the chance to correct it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text from Daniel. "Got promoted today." I smiled instantly. "Proud of you," I typed back. There was a pause before his response came through. "Thanks for not giving up on us." I stared at the message for a long moment. I hadn't realized until then that he had interpreted my persistence as faith. Maybe it was. Faith that we were capable of better. Faith that our family was worth uncomfortable conversations. Faith that love could survive pride. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the greenhouse glowed softly from within, like a lantern in the dark. And I understood something clearly. Being uninvited had been a turning point, not because it hurt, but because I chose not to let that hurt dictate my response. I could have withdrawn. I could have sent the gift anonymously. I could have allowed distance to grow quietly. Instead, I walked into the room. I asked them to open the envelope. I stayed. And sometimes staying is the bravest thing you can do. Because walking away protects your ego, but staying protects your relationships. That doesn't mean staying in harm's way. It means standing firm in love without surrendering your truth. Our family wasn't perfect now. Disagreements would come again. That's inevitable. But something foundational had changed. We had learned to speak before resentment could fester. We had learned to listen without immediately defending. And most importantly, we had learned that exclusion isn't the same as peace. As I locked up the greenhouse and walked back towards the house, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. The gift I gave my parents wasn't the property. It wasn't the patio. It wasn't even the greenhouse. It was the refusal to let silence win. And in return, they gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. Recognition. Not as the responsible daughter, not as the difficult one, but simply as their child. Valued, included, loved.
There's a quiet kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with applause or dramatic speeches. It shows up in small, ordinary moments, like my father calling just to ask how my week is going, or my mother texting me a photo of her first orchid bloom of the season with nothing but a heart emoji beneath it. For years, I had measured my role in the family by responsibility. I was the one who remembered appointments, who asked about insurance renewals, who quietly transferred money when something fell short. I had convinced myself that being needed was the same as being loved. It took being excluded to realize that I didn't want to be needed. I wanted to be chosen. And now, slowly, I was. One Saturday afternoon, my parents invited me over for lunch, not to review paperwork, not to discuss construction, just lunch. My mother had made her chicken soup, the one she used to prepare whenever I was sick as a child. As we sat at the kitchen table, my father looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "That sounds dangerous," I teased lightly. He smiled. "I've been thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come to the anniversary." I stirred my soup slowly. "We've talked about that." "Not fully," he replied. "I mean, really thought about it." My mother set down her spoon and nodded. "We would have convinced ourselves you were too busy, that you understood." "And over time," my father continued, "that story would have hardened. We would have believed it." I knew he was right. That's how distance grows, not in explosions, but in quiet assumptions repeated until they feel like truth. "I don't blame you for being hurt," he added gently. "You had every right to walk away." "I didn't want to walk away," I said honestly. "I wanted you to see me." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We see you now." It sounds simple, doesn't it? But being seen, truly seen for your intentions instead of being misinterpreted, that changes everything. Daniel's growth continued in ways that surprised all of us. He started coming to family dinners with ideas not about business ventures, but about experiences, hiking trips, cooking classes, small things we could do together. He wasn't chasing grand success anymore. He was building steady ground beneath his feet. One evening, he asked if we could all sit down together. There was a nervous edge in his voice that caught my attention. We gathered around the patio table, the lights above us casting a soft glow. He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about the loans," he began. My parents exchanged a quick glance, but they stayed silent. "I don't want them hanging over us. I've worked out a repayment plan. It'll take time, but I want to pay you back." My mother immediately shook her head. "Honey, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "Not because you're demanding it, but because I need to." I watched my father carefully. This was a delicate moment. Pride could easily step back in. Instead, he nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, we'll accept it." There was no tension in his voice, no control, just respect. Daniel looked at me briefly, almost as if seeking confirmation. I gave him a small nod. Later that night, as we cleaned up dishes together, he leaned toward me. "You changed the dynamic," he said quietly. "I didn't. We all did. But you started it." I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I had started it, not by buying the property, but by refusing to let avoidance define us. A few weeks later, my parents hosted a small anniversary dinner, just immediate family this time. No grand banquet hall, no 70 guests, just the 4 of us seated around the patio table with simple candles and homemade food. Halfway through the evening, my father stood up. 40 years, he said, looking at my mother. "And I'm still learning." She smiled. "So am I." He turned toward Daniel and me. "And being married for 40 years doesn't make you immune to mistakes. It just means you've had 40 years to practice correcting them." He looked directly at me. "Thank you for giving us that chance." There was no grand gesture this time, no envelope, no public reveal, just acknowledgement. After dinner, my mother brought out a small wooden box. "I have something for you," she said, handing it to me. I frowned slightly. "You don't have to. Open it." Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, simple, elegant. Engraved on the inside were 3 words, "Always included." My breath caught. "We should have told you that," she said softly, "instead of making you prove it." Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. "I don't need jewelry," I whispered. "It's not about the bracelet," my father said gently. "It's about the reminder." I slipped it onto my wrist, feeling the cool metal settle against my skin. For so long, I had carried the silent burden of being the responsible one, the steady one, the one who fixed things. And while there's nothing wrong with strength, it can become isolating when it's misunderstood. Being excluded had forced a reckoning, not just for them, but for me. I realized I had allowed my identity to revolve around management and protection. I rarely expressed vulnerability. I rarely admitted when I was tired of being the steady one. That began to change too. One evening, as my mother and I sat in the greenhouse, I told her something I hadn't said out loud before. "I was scared," I admitted, "when you told me not to come." Her face softened immediately. "Of what?" "Of that I wasn't essential, that if I stopped trying, you wouldn't notice." She looked stunned. "Claire, I know it sounds childish." "It doesn't," she said firmly. "It sounds human." We sat there quietly for a moment.
You are essential, she continued, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. Hearing that from her, clearly, directly, untangled something inside me that I hadn't realized was still knotted. Sometimes the bravest act isn't confronting others, it's admitting your own fear. As seasons shifted and the greenhouse filled with new blooms, our Anley settled into a healthier rhythm. We still disagreed occasionally. My father still had moments of stubbornness. Daniel still chased ideas, just smaller, more grounded ones. And I still asked practical questions. But now, when tension surfaced, it didn't hide. It was addressed. Openly. Respectfully. And that made all the difference. One quiet evening, I stood on the patio alone, looking at the house I had grown up in. The added space blended so seamlessly now that it felt like it had always been there. I thought back to the moment in the garden when my father had said, "We need this day to be peaceful." At the time, those words felt like rejection. Now, I understand, they were rooted in fear. And fear, when left unspoken, isolates. But when confronted with love, it loses its power. I ran my fingers over the bracelet on my wrist. Always included. The words weren't just sentimental, they were a promise, one built not on perfection, but on honesty. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of understanding. And sometimes the most powerful way to protect your place in someone's life is to show up when it would be easier not to. Because love doesn't retreat at the first sign of discomfort. It stays. It speaks. It listens. And when necessary, it opens the envelope anyway.
Time has a way of testing whether change is real or just emotional momentum. In the months after the anniversary, after the greenhouse and the apologies and the bracelet engraved with always included, life settled into something steady. And steady, I've learned, is far more meaningful than dramatic. It was early autumn when the next real test came. My father called me one afternoon, his voice measured but tight. "Can you come over?" he asked. "Of course," I replied immediately. Old instincts still lived inside me. When I arrived, both he and my mother were sitting at the kitchen table. Papers were spread out between them, medical forms, insurance documents, a referral from a specialist. My chest tightened before either of them spoke. "It's nothing urgent," my mother said quickly, reading my expression. "Just follow-up tests." That I could see the worry in her eyes. A year ago, this conversation would have been different. They might have minimized it, delayed telling me, decided they didn't want to burden me. Instead, my father said plainly, "We want you involved." The words landed gently but firmly, not because they needed me to take over, but because they trusted me. We spent the next hour going over options together, not with panic, not with hidden tension, just clarity. When I offered suggestions, they listened without defensiveness. When they expressed hesitation, I didn't interpret it as resistance. At one point, my mother reached for my hand. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I want to be," I replied. And for the first time in my adult life, that sentence felt balanced. I wasn't being the responsible one out of obligation. I was present because I chose to be. The tests turned out fine, routine concerns amplified by fear, but the process itself revealed something important. We were no longer avoiding hard conversations. We were walking through them together. Daniel stepped up in his own way during that time. He drove our mother to one of the appointments when I had a work conflict. He sat in the waiting room, flipping nervously through outdated magazines, and later admitted to me that it scared him more than he expected. "I don't like thinking about them getting older," he said quietly. "None of us do," I replied, "but pretending doesn't stop it." He looked at me surprised. That's new for you. What is? Letting someone else share the weight. I smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. I had spent years carrying things silently because it felt efficient, because I thought strength meant handling everything alone. But isolation isn't strength, it's armor, and armor keeps people at a distance. One evening, as the leaves began turning amber and gold, my father invited me to sit with him on the patio. The air was crisp and the greenhouse glowed softly behind us. "I've been thinking about legacy," he said. "That sounds serious," I replied lightly. "It is." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I used to think legacy was about property, about assets, about leaving something tangible behind." I waited. But this year taught me something else. Legacy is about the emotional structure you leave your family with. I felt that sentence settle deeply. If we had continued avoiding conflict, that would have been our legacy. Distance, resentment. "But you didn't," I said. "No," he agreed, "because you forced us to confront ourselves." I shook my head gently. "You chose to listen." He smiled. "Eventually." We both laughed softly. He turned serious again. "I want you to know something. When we told you not to come to the anniversary, it wasn't because we didn't value you. I know that now. It was because you challenged us, and being challenged felt uncomfortable." "I wasn't trying to win," I said quietly. "I see that." He paused. "You were trying to protect the family long term. We were trying to protect our comfort short term." That distinction mattered. Comfort feels safe, but it rarely builds anything lasting. As the weeks passed, the greenhouse became a symbol not just of reconciliation, but of growth. My mother began hosting small gardening workshops for neighbors. She would stand in the center of the glass room, sunlight catching in her silver hair, explaining soil composition and watering cycles with quiet authority. Watching her, I realized something. She hadn't needed me to rescue her. She had needed space to flourish. And sometimes protecting someone means creating that space, not controlling it. Daniel, too, began inviting us into his life in healthier ways. He shared his promotion news, asked for advice without defensiveness, offered help without being prompted. At Thanksgiving, held for the first time on the new patio, he stood up before dinner. "I want to say something," he began. My parents exchanged amused glances, expecting a joke, but his voice was steady. "This year was hard for all of us, and I played a part in that. I leaned too much. I avoided accountability." He looked at our parents, then at me. "Thank you for not letting me stay stuck." There was no dramatic music, no audience beyond family, just sincerity. My mother wiped her eyes. My father nodded once firmly. And I felt something shift again, not in a grand way, but in a foundational one. We were no longer operating from old roles. We were adapting, growing, choosing each other consciously. Later that evening, after dishes were washed and leftovers packed away, I stepped outside alone. The patio lights glowed overhead. The greenhouse shimmered softly in the distance. I thought about the night of the anniversary, about standing in that banquet hall, holding an envelope that could have changed everything, or nothing. I thought about how close we had come to drifting apart quietly, politely, permanently. And I realized something profound. The real miracle wasn't the gift. It was the decision to confront discomfort instead of accommodating it. So many families choose silence because it feels safer. They swallow hurt to avoid scenes. They avoid conversations to preserve appearances. But unspoken tension doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It hardens. It isolates. What saved us wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't public apology. It was courage. The courage to show up. The courage to open the envelope in front of everyone. The courage to say, "This hurt me," and the courage to respond with, "I was wrong." I touched the bracelet on my wrist,
always included, and felt a quiet gratitude wash over me, not for the pain, but for the growth that followed it. Because here's what I've learned. Being excluded doesn't define your worth. How you respond to exclusion reveals your strength. You can retreat, you can retaliate, or you can remain steady in who you are and let truth do its work. That night in the banquet hall, I didn't fight, I didn't accuse, I simply gave a gift that reflected my heart, and in doing so, I held up a mirror. What they saw in it changed us all. As the cool night air wrapped around me, I realized something else. The lot next door was once empty space. Now it held light, warmth, life, and in many ways, so did we.
Winter arrived quietly that year, settling over the patio and greenhouse with a soft silver hush. The glass panels fogged gently in the mornings, and my mother took to wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders before stepping inside to tend to her plants. The greenhouse, insulated and warm, stood like a small beacon against the cold. I often thought about how fitting that was, because warmth, I had learned, isn't accidental, it's cultivated. The first snow of the season fell in early December. I drove over to my parents' house before work, something I hadn't done in years without a specific reason. This time, there was no paperwork waiting, no crisis to manage. I just wanted to see them. My father was outside, brushing snow off the patio furniture. He looked up, surprised. "What are you doing here so early?" he asked. "Checking on the greenhouse," I teased. He chuckled. "It's holding up fine." We stood side by side for a moment, watching our breath cloud the air. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about something else." "That's twice in 1 year," I joked gently. He ignored the jab, though a smile tugged at his lips. "When we told you not to come to the anniversary, I didn't just hurt you." I waited. I hurt myself. That caught my attention. "How?" He leaned the broom against the railing. "By acting out of fear instead of love, I compromised who I say I am." That was a level of self-awareness I hadn't heard from him before. I've always told people family comes first, but when things got uncomfortable, I chose convenience. I steadied him quietly. "It takes courage to admit that." He nodded once. "It took your courage first." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply stood there with him in the snow, the silence no longer heavy or defensive. Later that week, my mother invited me to help decorate the greenhouse for the holidays. She strung delicate white lights along the beams, their reflection multiplying against the glass walls. Small red bows were tied around pots of winter herbs. It felt magical. "I never imagined this space would become so important," she said softly. "It was always important. It just didn't exist yet." She paused, then turned toward me. "Just like our honesty." I smiled. "Exactly." That December, we hosted Christmas dinner on the patio for the first time. Heaters hummed softly at the edges, and the table was dressed in deep green and gold. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't crowded, but it was intentional. Midway through dinner, my father cleared his throat. "I want to revisit something," he said. Daniel and I exchanged curious glances. "The anniversary, not the mistake, the meaning." He looked at my mother, then at us. 40 years of marriage isn't about avoiding conflict, it's about surviving it honestly. And this year reminded me that parenting is no different. My mother reached for his hand. "We almost lost something precious because we didn't want to feel uncomfortable." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. "I contributed to that too." "We all did," I said gently. My father nodded. "That's the point. Families fracture when everyone protects their own pride. And heal,"
my mother finished, when someone chooses humility. The word humility echoed in my mind long after dinner ended. That's what it had really been about from the beginning. Not money, not invitations, humility. The willingness to admit you were wrong. The willingness to accept love even when it confronts you. A few days after Christmas, I found myself alone with Daniel again. We were taking down decorations in the greenhouse, carefully wrapping the light strands for storage. "Do you ever think about how different this year could have gone?" he asked suddenly. "All the time. If you hadn't shown up. If Dad had doubled down instead of apologizing. If you'd stayed defensive." He nodded slowly. "It's strange how one decision can change the trajectory of everything." I thought about that for a moment. It wasn't just one decision, it was a series of them. Like what? Choosing to come, choosing to open the envelope, choosing to apologize, choosing to listen, choosing to forgive. He smiled faintly. "When you list it like that, it sounds simple." It wasn't. No, it wasn't. As winter deepened, I began to notice something else inside me. A softness. For years I had carried a quiet resentment, not loud enough to cause open conflict, but steady enough to create distance. I had resented always being the responsible one, resented being misunderstood. That resentment had started to dissolve, not because my parents suddenly became perfect, but because I had finally expressed what I needed: to be included, to be heard, to be trusted, and they responded. One evening in late January, my mother called me unexpectedly. "I was going through old photo albums," she said. "I found something." She asked me to come over. When I arrived, she had several albums spread across the living room floor. She flipped to a page from my childhood, my 10th birthday party. I was standing between my parents, holding a homemade card I had crafted for them. "You wrote something inside," she said, handing it to me. In messy, uneven handwriting, it read, "I will always take care of you like you take care of me." I felt my throat tighten. "You were always protective," she whispered. "I was 10, I said softly. "Yes, and you meant it." I closed the album gently. "I still mean it," I admitted. She cupped my face with both hands. "We don't need you to protect us from everything. We need you to walk beside us." The difference between those two roles felt profound. Protector stands in front, companion walks alongside. That night, as I drove home through the quiet winter streets, I realized something. Being excluded had revealed more than just hurt. It had revealed imbalance, and restoring balance required all of us to shift, not just them. I had to let go of controlling outcomes. They had to let go of avoiding truth. Daniel had to let go of dependency. Growth rarely belongs to just one person. It's collective. By early February, the greenhouse began preparing for spring again. Tiny green shoots pushed up from dark soil, unaware of the cold still lingering outside. Watching them, I thought about resilience, about how something fragile can survive winter if given warmth and light. Our family had weathered something similar: the cold of pride, the frost of avoidance, the chill of exclusion. But warmth, steady warmth, had returned. And as I stood there, sunlight filtering through glass once more, I felt something steady inside me. Not triumph, not validation, but gratitude. Because sometimes the moment you think you've been pushed out is the moment you're actually being invited into something deeper.
Spring arrived slowly, as if it too wanted to be certain winter was truly finished before committing itself fully. The greenhouse came alive again, soft green shoots stretching upward, delicate blossoms opening with quiet confidence. I found myself spending more time there than ever before, not because anything was broken, but because it had become a place of reflection. One afternoon, as I helped my mother repot a cluster of orchids, she paused and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know," she said, brushing soil from her hands, "I used to think strength meant never needing correction." I smiled faintly. "That sounds familiar." She nodded. "But I've realized something. Strength is being willing to adjust." I leaned back against the wooden bench and let that settle in. Adjust. Not surrender, not lose identity. Adjust. That word described our family perfectly now. We hadn't erased our personalities. My father was still proud. My mother still avoided confrontation sometimes. Daniel still dreamed big. I still asked difficult questions, but we adjusted when necessary. And that adjustment changed everything. A few weeks later, my father surprised me again. He called and asked if I would join him at a financial planning seminar hosted at the community center. I nearly laughed at the irony. "You want to go to a seminar?" I teased gently. He replied simply, "I want to learn." So we went. We sat side by side in folding chairs, listening to a speaker discuss long-term security, risk management, and estate planning. A year earlier, my father might have bristled at the suggestion that he needed guidance. Now he took notes. Halfway through, he leaned toward me and whispered, "You were right to ask questions." I didn't respond immediately. I just reached over and squeezed his hand. Because it wasn't about being right, it was about being heard. Daniel's transformation continued quietly. He had settled into his position at work, and for the first time in years, his energy felt grounded. One evening, he invited us all to his apartment for dinner. It wasn't fancy, just pasta and a modest bottle of wine, but as we sat around his small table, I noticed something in his posture, confidence that didn't rely on grand promises. "I've started a savings account," he said casually at one point. My father raised an impressed eyebrow. "Responsible." Daniel grinned. "Don't push it." We all laughed. Later that evening, as I helped him wash dishes, he grew quiet. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me," I replied automatically. "I owe you acknowledgement," he corrected. "You saw the cracks before any of us did, and instead of letting them widen, you stepped in." "I stepped awkwardly," I admitted. "Still," he said, "you stepped." I thought about that for a moment. It's easier to step back when you sense resistance. It's easier to let people make mistakes quietly and tell yourself you tried. But stepping forward, especially when you risk rejection, takes a different kind of resolve. That night, driving home from his apartment, I realized something else had changed. I no longer felt like the outsider trying to re-enter my own family. I felt rooted. The bracelet on my wrist had become less symbolic over time, not because it meant less, but because the inclusion it represented had become natural. In early summer, my parents celebrated their 41st anniversary. This time, there was no grand banquet hall, no formal invitations printed in gold. Instead, they hosted a simple garden dinner in the backyard. As guests arrived, my father stood beside me greeting them. Not ahead of me, not separately, beside me. At one point, an old family friend approached and said, "I heard about last year. That must have been awkward." My father didn't hesitate. "It was necessary," he replied calmly. I glanced at him surprised. "Necessary?" the friend asked. "Yes," he said firmly.
We needed to confront ourselves. There was no embarrassment in his tone, no shame, just ownership. As the evening unfolded, my mother raised a glass for a short toast. Last year, we celebrated 40 years of marriage. This year, we celebrate something else. She looked directly at me. We celebrate honesty. The guests murmured approvingly. We learned that peace isn't the absence of tension, it's the willingness to address it. She reached for my hand. And sometimes the greatest gift your child can give you is truth. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't heavy this time. They were light. Later, after guests had left and the dishes were stacked inside, the four of us lingered on the patio. Daniel stretched back in his chair. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I used to think conflict meant something was wrong." "And now?" I asked. "Now I think avoiding conflict means something is wrong." My father chuckled softly. "You're learning." "So are you," Daniel shot back. We all laughed. But beneath the laughter was something steady. Respect. That's what had been missing before. We loved each other, that was never in question, but love without respect becomes fragile. Respect requires listening. It requires humility. It's seeing the other person's perspective even when it challenges your own. As the night deepened, I stood and walked toward the greenhouse one last time. The door creaked softly as I opened it. Inside, warm air wrapped around me, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. I ran my fingers lightly over the leaves, remembering the empty lot it once was. Unused, overlooked, full of potential no one acted on. And I thought about that night at the banquet hall, about the words, "We didn't invite you," how those words could have marked the beginning of distance, how easily they could have hardened into something permanent. But they didn't, because I chose to show up, because they chose to listen, because Daniel chose to grow. Healing doesn't erase the memory of hurt, it reframes it. The anniversary will always carry that shadow of exclusion, but it will also carry the light that followed. And sometimes that light shines brighter because of the darkness that came before it. As I stepped back onto the patio, my parents and brother were laughing about something trivial, an old family vacation mishap if I caught it correctly. I stood there for a moment, just watching them, not evaluating, not protecting, just present. And in that stillness, I understood the true moral of everything we had been through. You can't control whether someone misunderstands your intentions. You can't control whether fear makes them push you away, but you can control how you respond. You can respond with pride, or you can respond with love anchored in truth. That choice determines the future of the relationship. For us, love won, not because we were perfect, but because we were willing to adjust. And as I joined them at the table, sliding into my chair between my mother and my father, I felt something simple and profound. Not needed, not responsible, not excluded, just included, exactly where I belonged.
The final chapter of our story didn't arrive with fireworks or grand revelations. It arrived the way real life often does, quietly, in an ordinary moment that suddenly feels extraordinary only when you pause long enough to notice it. It was late summer when I found myself standing in the greenhouse at dawn. The air was soft and humid from the night's watering system, and sunlight was just beginning to filter through the glass panels in long golden streaks. The orchids were in full bloom now, deep violet petals, delicate white centers, and the faint, sweet fragrance of life continuing regardless of past mistakes. I had come early because I wanted silence, not the kind that isolates, the kind that allows reflection. My parents were traveling for a short vacation that week, something they had never done without excessive planning before. Daniel was busy with work, chasing stability in the way he had promised himself he would. The house felt unusually still. And in that stillness, I thought about everything that had happened since the anniversary night: the rejection, the gift, the apology, the conversations that followed, the slow rebuilding. I placed my hand lightly on one of the orchid stems and remembered the first time my mother told me plants don't respond to urgency. People are the same, I realized. You cannot rush healing. You cannot force trust. You cannot demand forgiveness before understanding is earned. You can only show up consistently and let time do the rest. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. It was a message from my father. "Arrived safely. Miss you already." I smiled. Simple words, but they carried something deeper than sentiment. They carried belonging. I typed back, "Miss you too. Take care of Mom." A few minutes later, another message arrived from Daniel. "Coffee later this week?" "Of course," I replied. I stood there for a long time after that, watching sunlight spread slowly across the greenhouse floor. I thought about the night at the banquet hall when I had walked in carrying that ivory envelope. If I had stayed home, mailed the gift, and let the story end politely, nothing would have changed. We would have maintained surface harmony, but beneath it, resentment would have grown like weeds in unspoken soil. Families don't break in loud, dramatic ways most of the time. They fracture quietly, through assumptions, through avoidance, through pride disguised as peace. What saved ours wasn't confrontation alone, it was the combination of confrontation and love. I had spoken my truth, they had faced theirs, and we met in the middle. Later that morning, I drove to the community center where my father was volunteering with a financial literacy program he had recently joined. I found him standing beside a whiteboard explaining budgeting concepts to a group of teenagers. He looked different now. Not younger, not physically changed, but lighter, more open. He caught sight of me and waved me inside. After his session ended, we walked out together into the warm summer air. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I used to believe being a good father meant solving problems before they reached you." I smiled. "And now?" He said, "Now I believe being a good father means teaching you how to solve them yourself." That was one of the most honest things he had ever said. "And you did both," I told him. He shook his head slightly. "Not always." "No," I agreed. "But you tried." And trying matters, because perfection is not the standard of love. Consistency is. That afternoon, we met Daniel at a small cafe near the river. The three of us sat outside, watching water move slowly beneath the sunlight. Daniel told us about a project he was considering. Nothing risky, nothing speculative, just a practical improvement initiative at his workplace. My father listened carefully before offering feedback. Not criticism, feedback. The difference was subtle but powerful. At one point, Daniel said, "I feel like I finally understand what stability means." "What does it mean to you?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Not being afraid that one mistake will collapse everything." I nodded slowly. "That's peace," my mother said when we told her later that evening. Peace isn't perfection. Peace is safety inside imperfection. The final realization came to me one night as I stood alone on the patio, the greenhouse glowing softly behind me like a lantern in the dark. I thought about the words that started everything. "We didn't invite you." Those words once felt like rejection. Now they felt like the beginning of something more complicated and more beautiful. Because sometimes exclusion is not the end of a relationship. Sometimes it is the moment that forces truth to surface.
And truth, though painful at first, is the soil where genuine connection grows. I realized then that the greatest victory was not proving my parents wrong, it was helping them become the kind of people who could admit when they were. And in doing so, I also became someone who could admit my own mistakes. Growth was never one-sided, it was shared. I touched the bracelet on my wrist one last time and whispered something quietly into the summer air. Thank you for choosing me. Not because I needed validation, but because belonging is not something you earn through perfection. It is something you receive when love and honesty meet halfway. Inside the house, I could hear my parents laughing at something Daniel said on the phone. Warm, natural, alive. And I understood more deeply than ever that the story that began with exclusion ended not with revenge, not with bitterness, and not even with forgiveness alone. It ended with understanding. Because the truth is this: family is not defined by who is invited to the celebration. Family is defined by who stays when the conversation becomes difficult. And I stayed. They listened. We learned. And in the space between pride and vulnerability, we built something stronger than any anniversary party could ever represent. As I turned off the patio lights and walked inside, I felt a quiet certainty settle over my heart. I was no longer the daughter who feared being left out. I was the daughter who knew that even if fear appeared again, love had already learned how to answer it. And that was enough. The end.